Audio check. Right, 1 o'clock. Let's resume with cross-examination from Mr. Hon and then subsequently Mr. Morehouse. Probably not necessary to mention, but obviously after a very thorough cross-examination by Mr. Taylor, I suspect that your time estimates will be cut down fairly significantly because obviously we don't need to go over the same ground again, but over to you.
So yes, thank you. I gratefully adopt all the cross-examination and answers that we have heard this morning. And I have spent some considerable time removing questions from my cross-examination. There's still a couple of things I'd like to deal with.
Absolutely.
And I'm not in, there's some that's floating around which may or may not come out depending on answers.
Absolutely, yeah.
I'm very grateful. Dr. Osand-Ireland, good afternoon. I have no idea whether I look like I'm looking at you at all, but please rest assured that I am.
Good afternoon.
So can we please go first in your proof of evidence? I'd like to start by asking you just two questions about Jet Zero. And in fact, can we go not in your main proof, but in your supplementary proof of evidence, please? Which of course will be the first document I won't be able to find. Your addendum to paragraph 1.1.5 on page 5.
In summary, the key points are as follows.
Correct. And you see there at summary 3, all pathways to net zero considered by UK government anticipate accommodating an increase in passenger numbers between 58% and 60%, including Bristol Airport at 12 million passengers per annum. Do you see that?
I do, yes.
And you see that later on, in fact, in your proof, that's, of course, the summary, at your paragraph 3.1.7, you make exactly that same point in the middle of the page. So
yes,
that's on page 11. So can we go, please, to the evidence and analysis CD, which is the CD 9.136.
CD 9.1.
9.136, which is the evidence and analysis document. I think I have the run of Jet Zero documents later in the CD numbers than others, but I think they're all the same thing. So it's 9.136.
Yeah, the evidence and analysis. Yeah, I've got the same as you. So.
I'm very grateful for that. And if you go in that document, please, to page 22, and you'll see on page 22, there's a paragraph A7.
Yes.
And that follows on from discussions about airport capacity assumptions. Sorry, I should take you to that first on page 21. So we start airport capacity assumptions, and we see some text, but it finishes with this conclusion at A7. The modelling scenario that we have used should not therefore be seen as a prediction of what DFT thinks will happen with regard to future capacity expansion, but as a reasonable upper bound of possible future airport capacity levels and therefore associated emissions in order better to test the potential of measures to meet net zero. So it's very clear, isn't it, from that what you posit in your supplementary proof, that the DFT has expressed support. Explicitly, it is not expressing any support for the expansion of Bristol Airport to 12 million passengers per annum, is it, Dr. Osand-Ireland?
I think the government is supporting making best use of airports, but does the inclusion of the 12 million passengers per annum in the evidence analysis imply that the government is supporting this particular application? No, it's not.
Well, let's look again at what you say in your paragraph 3.2.1 in your supplementary. So that's on the next page, page 12.
Sorry, 3.
Yeah, so your paragraph numbering goes 3.2.1 on page 11.
Yes, it does, doesn't it?
And then, sorry, it goes 31.
Yes.
And there's an A and a B.
Yes.
And at the top of page 12, there's a B.
Yes.
And you say that these pathways,
Yes.
so the ones we've just looked at in Jet Zero, which the evidence and analysis document talks about, these pathways, you say, shows that the government's clear intention is to see passenger demand grow between 58 and 60% from a 2017 baseline. And the evidence and analysis document makes it clear that that is not at all what you should take from the document, doesn't it?
I would agree that maybe I went beyond what I should have done there, yes.
Next, please, to MBU. I have very few questions to ask on this.
Just, you'll have to forgive me, I'm a bit slower than you, I suspect. So we're back to CD6.
CD 6.10, I think it is. Well, actually, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to deal with it with your proof of evidence.
Okay.
So
Hang on then.
okay. Yes, if you have your proof of evidence in front of you.
Yes. Okay.
Now, I understand that you were watching and listening in yesterday when evidence was given. Is that right?
Yes, to most of it, yes. I did have some other things I was doing as well, but yes, I was.
I'm grateful. So, did you hear when Mr. Hunter-Jones was giving evidence? When he was cross-examined by Mr. Humphreys, there was a discussion about whether Mr. Hunter-Jones understood the airport's case properly. Did you hear that?
If you ask a specific question, I'll see if I can be clear.
Well, the way that Mr. Humphreys formulated Bristol Airport's case was that you do not rely on MBU to disregard the carbon or climate change impact of the proposed development. Do you remember that discussion?
Oh yes, I do, yes, yes.
So can we look, please, in your proof of evidence on page 35, the main proof.
Yes.
On page 35, you say there at paragraph 3.5.10, you give your summary of your view. And you say there, in summary, there are national and local planning policies that are relevant to the appeal proposal. It is clear, however, from paragraphs 1.8 to 1.12 of Beyond the Horizon Making Best Use, that development control policies are not intended to apply to carbon emissions from domestic or international aviation. Those are matters for control at national and indeed international level. What do you mean by that, Dr. Osland-Ireland?
Right, okay. So what I mean by that is that national and local planning policies do apply to all of the emissions in terms of the carbon emissions, so all of the emissions from the airport. But when it comes to the assessment in front of the planning authority needs to include the aviation emissions. I'm going to make that first point. What I meant by that was that whereas the emissions from the airport operations and surface access I would consider to be subject to development control at the local level, the emissions from domestic international aviation in terms of control are dealt with at the national level. So I was making a differentiation between planning policy, planning requirements, and how those emissions are controlled.
Okay. And so do we take it from that then that you accept, when one is understanding the significance of the impacts of aviation, one still has to undertake the assessment, and it's not a question of whether MBU and development control policies apply to aviation or not? Sorry, I'm just trying to understand what you're saying.
Yeah. Okay, so I think my take on this is that in terms of the environmental assessment, the emissions from all activities associated with the airport need to be included in that assessment. Okay. However, then it's so. But when we look at the Ima Guidance, and the first thing to do is to quantify the emissions, or estimate, calculate the emissions, which is what we did. We then look at how those emissions can be controlled. Okay, and then we look at the significance of the residual, if you like. So in my mind, the control levers, if you like, in terms of the airport operations and surface access lie with the local planning authority. Okay, but the control measures of aviation from the aircraft emissions lie with government. Now, that doesn't mean that the local planning authority should, or that we should present, or indeed any developer should present the environmental assessment and simply say, we've not included aviation emissions because that's not a local planning issue. To me, that's not how the environmental impact assessment should work. I have to say, in my career, I have worked with a developer who did try and suggest that for a power station, but we had to correct him.
Right. What you've done instead is you've included your assessment of the extent of the emissions, which I'll come to. But then, as I understand what you've just said, you then look at how they're controlled before you determine their significance. No.
Okay. So the way the Ima Guidance works is that the starting point is that the carbon emissions have an impact on global warming by definition on the planet, and therefore the receptor is considered to be highly sensitive. So the next stage is to determine the magnitude of those emissions, and if those and then I think in the Ima Guidance it says that any emissions can be considered significant. Now, what that means is that those are, if you like, gross emissions. Those are the uncontrolled emissions, and therefore the next step is to control them. And then once you've implemented those controls, you then look at the residual. Okay, and then you would then, as a result of that assessment, you would then determine whether they are significant. And so the test of significance, if you like, can be applied at each phase of that assessment process.
So I understand it now that what you're saying in your paragraph 3.5.10 is that based on MBU, you understand that you look at national policies for control, and then you understand after that what any residual aviation emissions are present, and that's what you understand for significance.
Well, it's okay. So we looked at.
Can you say whether that's correct or not before you give any?
Well, I'm not sure it is, but I think maybe maybe I try and describe it. I think it's important that because I don't think this is a point of real contention. So I'm really want to try and make it understood. Okay, so the process we took is that we quantify. Well, first of all, we define the receptor, and we say that's highly significant. It's highly sensitive. The second step is to quantify the emissions. So the emissions uncontrolled, there are emissions, and therefore we would deem that, I would deem that, IEMA would deem that as being significant. Okay, in terms of they need to be, you can't just accept them as part of the development. Something needs to be done about them. They need to be controlled.
We're agreed.
Okay, that's the first step. The second step then is to look at how they can be controlled.
Yes.
Okay, so when we talk about the building operations and so on at a local level, can they be controlled to the point where the, if you like, the residual emissions are acceptable, are not significant, should we say? And in this case, the control measure or the control measures would result in the airport operations, the ground operations.
So, I'm sorry to cut in, but I'm not asking you about the buildings, very explicitly not. I'm asking about what you have said about the aviation emissions. And from what you're describing, exactly the process that I just described to you is what you've undertaken, that you've looked at how the emissions are controlled in order to understand the extent of their significance?
Yes. So in the assessment of the emissions, we actually looked at whether the emissions would form a significant part or share of the planning assumption. That's how we looked at the significance, and therefore would that impact on government policy being able to achieve carbon net zero.
Okay. That's very helpful, thank you. And then I won't go into any of that because I adopt the answer you gave to my learned friend. I will ask you something about the Ima Guidance.
Of course.
In fact, let's do that now. Can you go to the Ima Guidance, please? That's CD 9.47.
Hang on. Yes.
And if you go to the very last page of that document, you'll see that that's a document from 2017, isn't it?
Yes, it is, yeah.
If you go then into internal page 15 of that document, you'll see a box 4, against a green background. Do you see that?
Page 15, yes, that's box 4. Yes, I got that. Yeah.
Targets based on scientific projections. And you'll see there that this begins with a reference to science-based targets are defined as greenhouse gas reduction targets based on scientific projections and global carbon budgets. And Ima says that these targets aim to mitigate the greatest effects of climate change by limiting greenhouse gas emissions within a certain cumulative threshold. This threshold has been defined by the IPCC as a carbon budget equivalent to a maximum increase in global temperatures of 2 degrees centigrade from pre-industrial levels. So first of all, just pausing there, those science-based targets from the IPCC are the ones that are referred to in Professor Anderson's evidence at paragraph 4.6 to 4.8.
Yes.
And then Ima says next, there's currently, and of course that's 2017, there's currently little evidence of these science-based targets being used in UK's development consent system or related EIA process to assess a project's significance. However, this quantitative approach provides a good indicator of significance and could be used in EIA to calculate a project's carbon budget. The budget can then be compared against an existing carbon budget, global, national, sectoral, regional, or local, as available, to identify the percentage impact the project will contribute to climate change. So first we take from that Ima considered in 2017 that this was a good approach, a quantitative approach, but that it was at that stage little used.
That's correct.
And then Ima also directs those conducting assessments, if they consider using this analysis, to look at global, national, sectoral, regional, or local budgets as available.
Yes.
And if you read on then, Ima identifies a number of methodologies in the next column, a literature review, a number of different methodologies which can be used to allocate a project's carbon budget, grandfathering, carbon space, etc., etc.
That's right. But if we can just turn back to the science-based targets.
Yes?
So the way science-based targets are being adopted quite widely, actually, is through the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure.
Okay, can I just stop you there? I wasn't asking you about that. I'm sure you can say whatever you'd like to say as a qualification to my actual questions. But let's get through the questions and then we can come back to that. So you see that there's the literature review that was undertaken and the various methodologies for conducting the assessment. If you take up Professor Anderson's proof of evidence, please. his main proof at paragraph 4.5.
Just bear with me.
Yes, to adopt my learned friend's expression, I need to bear with myself as well, as I don't have it either. So Professor Anderson yes, in his main proof of evidence, page 13, paragraph 4.5.
Yes, that's correct. Yes, I've got on there. Yes.
So you'll
yes.
see that he there refers to the various regimes available for apportionment of carbon budgets within groups of developed and developing countries according to population, historical emissions, etc., etc. Each has advantages and disadvantages. And when he and his colleagues undertook their analysis, they used the grandfathering process, and he gives you the CD reference, and then he explains a little bit about grandfathering. So when Professor Anderson was looking to use the IPCC's budgets, the approach that he undertook in terms of understanding there are different potential processes and choosing one, that's reflective of what IEMA is saying should be done, isn't it?
Yes, but I would need to check whether that's reflective of what the Science Based Targets Initiative suggests.
Okay. Then at paragraph 4.6, Professor Anderson sets out what he and his colleagues did. And then if you go on in his proof of evidence to page 37,
6.7.4.
6.7.4.
Yeah.
He then explains in relation to the production of local authority budgets, the kind of next stage in what happened in this story. So he explains that at the behest of the Greater Manchester Combined Authorities, and you heard his examination about this, he and his colleagues were asked to estimate carbon budgets for every local authority, and they did so, and they undertook the estimation for North Somerset Council as well. And I think you've just confirmed that you heard his evidence on this earlier in the week.
Yes, I did. Yeah, I was very, very interested in this.
And you see also in his appendix, I mean, you don't really need to go there. His appendix 9 just gives you the landing page on the website for where those budgets are made publicly available. And they are publicly available, aren't they?
Okay, I'll take your word for it.
Then in his proof of evidence at paragraph 6.7.3, you see how he's allocated emissions from aviation at Bristol to North Somerset Council, and you see the table there. And you'll recall that Mr. Humphreys cross-examined Professor Anderson a little bit on that to get some more information about how it was done. You have not taken issue with the approach or any of the numbers in this table, have you?
No. I think the methodology and of course I would assume the results follow the methodology, of course. But yes, no, it's an interesting piece of work.
And then paragraph 6.7.5 on page 37 sets out the budget for the remaining periods for North Somerset. You see that on the right-hand side of the table.
Yes.
And you see he sets that out for, in fact, way beyond what we're interested in, but he sets it out quite clearly up to 2047 and then a longer period up to 2100. You see that?
I do, yes.
And then over the page, we get a conclusion. At his paragraph 6.7.7, he addresses the additional emissions from the expansion of the airport from 10 to 12 mppa. And he takes your estimate in the ES addendum. And he applies that to North Somerset Council, which is the final column on table 3, which we looked at. And he comes to the conclusion that by 2040, those extra emissions, if extrapolated for the 5-year budget period, consume 82% of that 5-year budget. So based on what Ima said is a methodology for understanding the extent of the impact of a project, that assessment is relevant to the inspector's determination here, is it not?
It's one approach that could be applied, yes.
And in your assessment of the impact of emissions, you did not have any recourse to local budgets when you carried out your assessment, did you?
No, I didn't, and please let me qualify that, if I may.
Of course.
So, in my experience, I've also dealt with Section 36 of the Electricity Act, which specifically looks at power generating facilities above 50 megawatts thermal, and that section was specifically added to the Electricity Act because if you look at the emissions from a power station, they are disproportionate in terms of local emissions, but obviously contribute to the national emissions. So we do need to differentiate between what we control or at the national level and what we control at the local level. So I think this method, which I do think it is a valid method, but it should be applied to the local emissions, i.e. the non-aviation emissions. I think it would be a perfectly valid assessment. I think if you wanted to include the aviation emissions, you would need to look at that on an individual basis, as in per head of population basis.
So do I take it from that answer that you applied an approach to assessing airport aviation emission, let me start that question again. Do I take it from that answer that you applied an approach when assessing the impact of an airport expansion, you applied an approach derived from the expansion of power plants?
No, I'm giving you an example of where applying, if you like, an infrastructure that contributes to the national economy and is managed and is controlled at the national level. Applying that at the local level causes distortion. So, if, for example, if we applied this to the M5 motorway, what would be the result there?
I see. Okay. That's very helpful. I can make some submissions on that. Let's look at your tests for when you consider whether there's going to be impact. Let's go back into your proof of evidence, please, at your paragraph 4.2.7 on page 44.
Just before we do that, if I can return just quickly to the Ima Guidance. The Ima Guidance makes it very clear there is no fixed one method for assessing significance, and it also says that this guidance needs to be reviewed once it's been implemented through the planning system and to gain experience and knowledge of how it's being used. So I think we should accept that Ima Guidance is work in progress. However, I do not, it does provide some very, very useful guidance in the state that it's in.
Yes, and part of the reason that we went to this, which was one of my set of questions, which I was a bit up in the air, part of the reason we went to this was because you explicitly relied on the Ima Guidance in answers to questions that I asked you earlier on in my cross-examination. So you're not withdrawing or stepping away from your reliance on the Ima.
But I just want to highlight the point that the Ima Guidance doesn't specify one specific method.
Oh, and I'm glad actually that you didn't move away from this topic, because it's just one thing I need to put to you that I've been flagged by Professor Anderson. So can you go back into his proof of evidence, please, at
Yes.
paragraph 6.7.3 on page 36?
Yes.
Is what we're looking at. And you remember I put those numbers to you, and you confirmed that you were happy with both the methodology and the numbers.
Yes.
And it's right, isn't it, that when this analysis was undertaken, Professor Anderson expressly related the emissions to North Somerset residents using the airport only. So in terms of taking into account your concern about the local distortions, that's been dealt with, hasn't it?
Yes, but Professor Anderson himself did comment that there was a limitation to that method, and more could be done. And I think it's as a first step, it's very useful. But I would agree that more could be done.
Yes. Yeah. So he's picked up and addressed exactly the point that you were making.
Yep, that's fine.
So your paragraph 4.2.7 in your proof of evidence.
Yes.
Please. You set out there the two tests that you have applied in order to understand, or in order to evaluate the appeal proposal, the magnitude, you say, of the appeal proposal. And you've said the first is the extent to which the scheme materially affects the ability of the UK to meet aviation planning assumption, and the second is the extent to which the scheme affects the ability of the UK to meet its target and budgets. And then, in your next paragraph, you say what you're doing in your evidence, and you say you've approached the assessment of significance in two ways. Consideration of the change of carbon emissions as a percentage of the planning assumption, I'm not going to ask you anything about that, or determination of whether the change in carbon emissions would prevent the UK government achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And I just wanted to ask you about this. There's a difference, isn't there, between determining whether emissions would prevent the UK government achieving net zero by 2050 and the extent to which a scheme might materially affect the ability to meet the aviation planning assumption. Prevent and materially affect are two different things, aren't they?
Yes, but I think I probably meant them in the same way. That's exposing my limitations and unloyal, I think.
Then you've told us of your views about the Secretary of State being under a legal duty under the Climate Change Act to achieve net zero by 2050 and to meet the carbon budgets. And you've made it very clear that you've relied on that in making your assessment. Given that, when would any development that has a greenhouse gas impact ever prevent or materially affect the ability of government to achieve its net zero targets?
Absolutely, I agree with that statement. If the greenhouse gas emissions are not controlled, then I completely agree with you. Then we cannot rely simply on the Secretary of State to control those emissions on our behalf. It is important that the application, whatever the application is, controls the emissions it can and is engaged with the other control measures that are available to ensure that the carbon emissions, or to ensure carbon net zero, is achieved. So there has to be active participation. I agree.
I understand. So your reliance on the Secretary of State achieving net zero and the sixth carbon, well, I should do that the other way around. Your reliance on the Secretary of State achieving the sixth carbon budget and then net zero is based on your understanding of the control measures that he or she maybe will be applying.
Yes.
Yes. And then I don't need to ask you about any of that because that's already been asked in my learned friend's cross-examination. Can I just ask you one thing about, I'm not going to ask you that. Can I ask you now about the Climate Change Committee's pathways? So, you remember in examination in chief yesterday, you referred to the fact that the Climate Change Committee has 4 emissions pathways. You referred to sustainable aviation having some pathways, and you referred to the pathways in the Jet Zero consultation. But I don't take it from that you were suggesting, in terms of a robust approach to assessing the significance of the impact of a proposed development, that there's an equivalence between those pathways.
Well, I think if we take all those pathways together, what they do is they show a range of mix of policies, and it's a common basket of policies, or measures that could be applied in varying combinations and mixes, all with the intention of achieving carbon net zero. So, of course, there are differences between those pathways, and indeed the Climate Change Committee itself says that in theory there could be an infinite number, that's not the word they use, but there's a large number of different pathways that could be adopted.
That wasn't quite the question that I was asking you, though, was it, Dr. Ozendaland? I was saying that in terms of impact assessment and understanding the significance of the impact of a proposed development, essentially, not all pathways are equal. They don't share equal equivalence of importance in the assessment. Maybe I'm being unfair. Let me ask you this.
I really
unless you want to answer.
I don't understand the question. I really genuinely don't understand.
That's quite all right. I'll rephrase it. Are you aware that planning practice guidance directs practitioners to the Climate Change Committee as the independent statutory body established under the Climate Change Act 2008 when they're understanding the climate impacts?
Yes.
Yes. And the Ima Guidance also refers those conducting impact assessment to the Climate Change Committee's guidance, doesn't it?
Yes.
And so in terms of robustness, when one is understanding the impacts of a development, one looks first at the Climate Change Committee's pathways, doesn't one?
Sorry, can you repeat that question?
Yes.
When first looking at the...
When looking at the extent of the significance of a development and comparing it with a pathway or pathways, one looks first at the Climate Change Committee's pathways.
Okay, I see what he's trying to say. So we have looked, so in table 4.1 of my evidence.
Can you just say whether that's yes or no, and then you can tell me your...
Well, I think you should have, yes. You should have
if you take him to the thing in the MPPF that you were relied on, just because he's not a planning witness, just so that he's orientated. So
well, I think he indicated he was aware of it, and also aware of the Ima Guidance.
He's aware of the MPPF, but just so that he's orientated. He's not a planning witness, he's a climate change person. What's the paragraph so that we can look at it?
All right, so let's go to the Ima Guidance first, because we were already in there. That's 9.47.
Yes.
And you'll see, let's go there first to page 8. Box, potential sources of information on greenhouse gas and energy projections. Box 3 on page 8.
Yes.
You see the very first thing there is the Climate Change Committee. It does say the 5th carbon budget, but of course now it's the 6th, isn't it?
That's fine. Well, and indeed the other documents produced by the Climate Change Committee, yes.
Yes. And then page
Hang on.
16.
With respect, you were putting, I think, a point that either IEMA or MPPF,
The planning practice guidance.
planning practice guidance, sorry, indicated you had to go first to the CCC. I may have misunderstood the point, but I just wanted to make sure I'm following it so I can re-examine if I need to. So box.
Yes. So the progress is this, so that you understand. The witness has drawn attention to a number of pathways. I'm asking whether they are all equally robust for the purpose of impact assessment.
Okay, sorry.
We
I
were
won't.
examining whether that's the case. I've taken the witness to the planning practice guidance and the Ima Guidance, which refers to the Climate Change Committee. And I think we got to the stage where we were going to agree, well, maybe not, I'll put the question again. So in terms of robustness of assessment, when assessing the impacts of a proposed development, the Climate Change Committee's pathways are plainly robust, are they not?
The impact assessment is of the development, not of the Climate Change Committee's pathways. In the assessment of the development, we have referred to the Climate Change Committee in numerous locations. And as I was going to refer to in my proof of evidence, table 4.1 on page 42, we actually include the full pathways that the Climate Change Committee included in its 6 carbon budget report. So is there a suggestion that we have not made reference to the Climate Change Committee?
Didn't say that.
So presumably that was a yes.
Yeah, presumably that was a yes.
The assessment has to be of the development, not of the Climate Change
I'm
Committee.
sorry, it's late in the week, and I've said umpteen times that I really would appreciate a yes-no answer where that's possible, and then clarification. So I intervene then to say, was that a yes? So was it a yes or was it a no? I'm getting the clarification, believe me, but I don't know the initial answer.
Is the question, did the impact assessment assess the
No.
climate change pathways?
Not in any
So
way,
what-
shape or form was that my question.
So please repeat the question, I apologise.
My question was, and reminding you that you yourself, in your evidence, referred to a number of different pathways. In answer to the same question, you referred to a number of different pathways. You did the same when I took you to them. You say they show a range of policies, a combination or a different mix of policies. But when one takes into account the planning practice guidance and the IEMA guidance, it is plain that when assessing the impact of a proposed development, the robust way is to assess in light of the CCC's pathways.
Yes, we assessed in light of CCC's pathways.
I'm not going to ask the question again. Can you
I've
look?
asked the question. The question is, the answer is yes.
The answer is yes. Can we go into Professor Anderson's proof of evidence, please? On page 31. You'll see there what is actually table 2. But you'll see there's a coy little T at the side. I mean, I think that's how it's printed out in mine. There's a little T at the side of the
Yes,
the
I've
figure
got
there.
that.
Yes, that little T should say table 2. So what Professor Anderson does here is he takes each of the years of assessment on which you alight, 2024, 2030, 2040, 2050, and in the right-hand column, he sets out the change in relation to 2017 required for the CCC's balanced net zero pathway for aviation. And just first, you don't disagree with or quibble with the numbers in that column, do you?
I haven't checked them, but I see no reason to disagree with them.
And on the balanced net zero pathway, all those numbers require a reduction, don't they?
Yes, they do, yes.
And then you see on the left-hand side, Professor Anderson sets out the change in emissions in relation to 2017 for Bristol Airport with expansion. Do you see that?
Yes, I do, yes.
And we see that all those numbers are positive numbers, don't we?
Yes.
And then go on, please, to paragraph 6.4.7.
Sorry, correction. There's a -6 at 2050.
Oh, yes, forgive me, yes. Well, yes, all those numbers are positive apart from the minus at the end, -6 at the bottom. So positive in 2024, positive in 2030, positive in 2040, but then down again to 29 kilotons of CO2 in 2050.
Okay.
But we see, and this is why I was taking you to the conclusion paragraph, what this shows. Because he sets out then the extent to which this demonstrates a shortfall or an underachievement by the airport against the balanced net zero pathways. And he draws out at paragraph 6.4.3 that there's a, well, let's start at paragraph 6.4.7. He draws out at paragraph 6.4.7 that without expansion, there's a shortfall against the balanced net zero pathway that is twofold. Do you see that?
Twofold. So anyway, 6.4.3.
6.4.7. Forgive me. Yeah, 6.4.7. I'm going with the without expansion case first.
Yes.
So even without expansion, there's a shortfall. In fact, it underachieves, this is 5 lines down, it underachieves the CCC's target by almost a factor of 2.
Yeah.
You see that. And then back over to where you were before, the previous page, 6.4.3.
Yes.
We see that if you take it with expansion, the shortfall or the underachievement is 6-fold, by a factor of 6.
Yes.
So the shortfall is much more with expansion than without expansion, isn't it?
The difference between the balance, the CCC's balanced net zero pathway and the airport, yes, the difference is more significant with the development, yes.
Yes. And that too is relevant to assessing the significance of the impact of this proposed development, isn't it?
Well, it's one way of assessing the results. What we have done is to compare against the carbon budgets and the carbon net zero targets. But what this, I think, what we need to do in this looking at this comparison is also refer back to table 4.1 in my proof.
Yes, that's exactly where we're going. Let's go there. Table 4.1 in your proof.
Okay.
I should have reassured you we were going to go there, and here we are. So table 4.1 in your proof of evidence. Please say what you want to say about it.
Right, so what this shows here is that the assumptions we've made in terms of efficiency improvements and share of sustainable fuels is actually is more conservative, I would say, than the Committee on Climate Change.
Yes.
Yeah. So therefore, the direct comparison of emissions is not quite the same. So we are assuming, if you like, higher emissions per airplane than the Climate Change Committee is. That's not quite right, but you get the point. So that would explain a large amount of the difference between the comparison of the balanced carbon net zero pathway and indeed the airport development. I think it would be, in this context though, would it not be right for Professor Anderson to have also compared with the headwinds, widespread engagement and the widespread innovation pathways?
So let's put aside your interests and questions in relation to Professor Anderson, and let's focus on what you've done.
Okay.
It's right, isn't it, that in this table 4.1, the only way in which you've assessed in relation to the CCC is to sense check as to whether the way in which you've understood the emissions is a reasonable worst-case scenario. Based on those criteria, emissions of million tons of CO2e, demand management efficiency, biofuels, biowaste, and synthetic jet fuel.
Yes, what we haven't done is to compare with what the Climate Change Committee expects the emissions to be in future years in one of their pathways.
Yes, exactly my point. Thank you very much. And then finally, when one is understanding, in fact, that's fine. Thank you very much. So let's move then on swiftly to non-CO2 emissions, please.
Okay.
And let's go into your proof, please, page 40, paragraph 3.7.9.
Yes.
You very fairly say in your conclusion on your analysis of non-CO2 emissions, you say that the non-CO2 impacts cannot be ignored and they need to be acknowledged today so that the choices made in the technologies used to reduce aircraft emissions do not result in CO2 impacts increasing. As the scientific understanding increases, the choices of technology will be better informed. So just pausing there, you do not, in the environmental impact assessment, undertake any assessment of the extent of non-CO2 emissions that will be caused by the proposed development, do you?
No, we don't, because there's no criteria to assess it against.
Well, that's not quite right, is it? Because if you take up Professor Anderson's proof of evidence, well, take up his appendices, please.
Okay.
If you take
Is this? Sorry, just wait for me. So, his appendix to proof of evidence, yes?
Yes, his appendices to the proof of evidence, Appendix 6.
Okay. Yes.
And you'll see, if you go into that document, page 86, we are into the Bayes document, 2019 Government Greenhouse Gas Conversion Factors for Company Reporting Methodology paper.
Yes.
And you'll see in the middle of that page, just above paragraph 8.39, Bayes' recommendation is the beginning of your view as well, that consideration of non-CO2 climate change effects on aviation can be important in some cases, so you can't ignore them. But what Bayes suggests is that there's a multiplier of 1.9 recommended as a central estimate based on the best available scientific evidence as summarized in, and then we're left hanging, but it does go on to talk about other things, and it's talked about where it's summarized above. So there is at least one source from Bayes which puts forward a criterion that could have been used, isn't there?
Well, in this document, Bayes is providing guidance on companies reporting their corporate emissions, and it provides not a criterion, but a factor, a multiplier that can be applied to account for non-CO2 emissions from aviation.
Yes, and you could have done that with exactly the caveat that you just gave in your environmental impact assessment in order for us to understand or have some indication of the extent of non-CO2 emissions.
Well, we wanted to reflect the government statements regarding non-CO2 was that when you look at the mitigation measures, the controls that could be applied to non-CO2 from aviation, it's important to consider it then. When the government provides further guidance on that, the carbon and climate change action plan includes the mechanism to account for that in the future.
So is your evidence that you wouldn't use this BEIS guidance because it's not directly related? Given that this is guidance that's available, and in fact guidance that's been put out a number of times, it's certainly there as guidance that you could have relied on, isn't it?
It is guidance that we have referred to, but as I say, we have in determining the impact of the development, we have considered the impact of non-CO2 to be more relevant to looking at what emission control measures could need or could be applied.
So don't worry, I am going to get to the mitigation element. Just for completeness, it's right, isn't it, and maybe you don't need to go there, that the 2021 BEIS methodology paper for conversion factors again refers to the 1.9 multiplier and recommends that it can be used in its methodology paper. Or do you want me to take you to it?
No, I think I'm going to, if you don't mind, I think I'd like to close this discussion by referring to the CCC document that was submitted last night on page 17.
Well, let's go to the BEIS document first, and then we can go to that one.
Well, no, I think actually on this occasion, just let the witness answer if he wants to go to the document, because we keep doing this and then not coming back to things. So just on this occasion.
I think we've come back to everything.
Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't mean that unfairly, but just on this occasion, let him do what he wants to do.
So we're looking at the methodology underlying the 6th carbon budget, are we?
Yes, we are, yes.
Yes. Where in that would you like to go?
So there remain significant uncertainties in the science and mitigation options.
I'm so sorry, where are you in the document again?
Page 17,
Page
final
17.
bullet.
Page 17, and there's a table.
I see, sorry, of the PDF that was issued yesterday. So page 269.
269. Yes?
So the final bullet point there refers to non-CO2 impacts.
Yes.
Okay, so there remain significant uncertainties in the science and mitigation options, and therefore uncertainties regarding the policy response. So we have focused on highlighting the need to consider non-CO2 in the mitigation, but in order to make the impact assessment and compare it to existing policies, we have not included that calculation in the assessment.
So you're aware when undertaking environmental impact assessment that it's important to apply the precautionary principle, aren't you?
Yes.
And the precautionary principle states that one doesn't exclude an important impact where there is a potential for risk or high risk just because there is some scientific uncertainty in relation to that impact.
If we had excluded non-CO2 impacts from the environmental assessment, I would agree with that. That would be incorrect. But we have included it. It's in the environmental. It's in the ESA.
But what you haven't done, so you've included it by saying, we don't know how much it's going to be, but we are going to assert that we can mitigate it. And I'm going to come on to the mitigation in a second. But what you have not done in your environmental impact assessment is given any indication of the extent of the non-CO2 emissions that this proposal will cause?
Because there isn't an agreed number. So there is the paper yesterday that was discussed on atmospheric environment was published, I think it was this month, wasn't it? So the science, it may be that the science is reaching the point where that uncertainty is being resolved, in which case we would expect government policy to follow and guidance to follow. In which case, so we might suppose in 6 months' time, if we were repeating the assessment, then yes, we would take account of what the science tells us.
Just one second. I just want to be sure I'm on the right document. You're referring to a document published?
So let me resolve this problem. What was being referred to was the Lee paper that we looked at, the scientific paper.
Yes.
So that was published recently, but let me take Dr. Oz and Ireland to where in the evidence we refer to the previous Lee paper, which was the basis of the previous Bayes publication. So I'm looking in Mr. Asher's rebuttal proof of evidence at page 12.
Bear with me.
Yep.
Rebuttal evidence, yeah.
Yes, rebuttal evidence.
Okay, yes. Page.
Page 12. So Mr. Asher there directs us to the 2021 Bayes updated version of the document at Appendix 6. And he refers to the fact that it retains the 1.9 times multiplier.
Yes.
And that's, of course, an update to the 2019 document. So if you take up again Professor Anderson's appendix, so we can look at the 2019 version. I think this is the best way to do this. Let me just bring it up again.
On page 86.
On page 86. You'll see, I put that paragraph to you on the other hand, the one in bold. Then you see the next paragraph down, Table 46 and the global warming potential 100 figure, consistent with the UN FCCC reporting convention, from the ATTICA research presented in Table 47 below, and an analysis in Lee et al. 2009 reported on by the CCC says in relation to the various global warming potentials, and it's set out there, and then it explains that the value of the 1.9 multiplier is subject to significant uncertainty, which was the point that you brought out earlier. So in terms of the science, there was a previous paper by Lee, which was updated in the most recent paper, wasn't there?
Yes, I don't disagree with this. However, what we have to do is assess the significance of the development against the carbon budget. And the carbon budget at the moment, and that's not to say it will change in the future, does not include non-CO2. When it includes non-CO2, you're absolutely right. This assessment should include non-CO2 to ensure we're comparing apples with apples. But at the moment, you're suggesting applying a factor of 1.9 or indeed 3 to the emissions from Bristol Airport's application, and comparing that against a total which doesn't include that factor of 1.9 or indeed 3.
So for the purposes of environmental impact assessment, it's right, isn't it, that when you are understanding the factors to be taken into account, one of the things, plainly, that you start with is the CCC's advice, but then one also looks at, for example, other guidance like the Bayes guidance to understand if there's criteria that you can apply in order to assist with understanding the extent of the impacts. So you don't stop your assessment just on the basis of the CCC's advice, do you?
No, that's right. Let me just. I agree with you that non-CO2 impacts should be included in environmental assessment. However, when we do the analysis of the results, we need to be able to compare with numbers which are comparable. In other words, they need to include the same things. So when we look at the carbon budget for the UK, it does not include, at the moment, it does not include non-CO2 effects of aviation. If it did, absolutely, this environmental assessment should include the non-CO2 impacts of aviation. So I don't disagree with you, but I don't think now is the right time because we're not ready to make that final assessment because we wouldn't be comparing the same numbers.
That's fine. I can make some submissions on the extent of environmental impact assessment. That's absolutely fine. Let's look at what you have done, which is you've said that it has to be taken into account. And then what you've done is you've suggested that it can be addressed with mitigation. Can you take up, please, Mr. Asher's rebuttal at paragraph 5.9 to 5.10 on page 14?
Sorry. Mr. Asher, proof of evidence, sorry.
Rebuttal proof. Mr.
Thank
Asher's
you.
rebuttal.
Yes. Yes, I've got that open.
Great.
Yeah.
Page 14, paragraphs 5.9 to 5.10. There, Mr. Asher deals with your evidence, and he refers back to your proof of evidence about the options outlined for reducing non-CO2 effects, picked up from the CCC, which is what you refer to when you're talking about potential mitigations, isn't it?
Well, I think at this stage we don't know what the right mix of mitigations is. So I think we have to start at that point that we don't know yet, and that's why it's part of the review. It's an important part of the action plans to make sure that the measures that are implemented take account of the full global warming impact of aviation. Obviously, in which case we're talking about non-CO2. Absolutely. Can I tell you what those measures are? Can I tell you what the...
Well, can we look at this? Because Mr. Asher runs through all the different measures. So he says alternative fuel, he says alternative flight routing. And he then goes on to address the fact that alternative flight routing and alternative fuel may well result in increases in impact rather than just resulting in decreases.
Yeah, I agree with you.
So given that you agree that there's the potential for these alternative approaches to result in increases rather than decreases, that's another basis on which you should have undertaken a more detailed assessment of the non-CO2 emissions, isn't it?
I disagree, because first of all, some of those measures to reduce emissions will also have a positive impact on reducing non-CO2 emissions. It's not as clear-cut as you're suggesting. It also, some of these measures also depend on where the flight is, the time of day, the season. These things need to be, it's complicated to try and do an assessment of it. I think would be, frankly, almost a meaningless exercise at this point, because what we want to do is make sure there is a mechanism in place to ensure that those impacts are considered when selecting the appropriate mitigation measures.
But at the moment, as I think you've just agreed, the mechanism, it's very difficult for these inspectors to give any weight to that mechanism, given that there's no understanding of whether it would be even feasible for it to begin to address the non-CO2 impacts.
I think the inspectors should take note of the fact that we have specifically highlighted this in the Carbon and Climate Change Action Plan, and that it is in line with the current government view on this. My expectation, and I'm sure of others, is that this will change. And in terms of it will change in that we will develop approaches to managing non-CO2 emissions from aviation.
So I'm going to move on to my final topic of cross-examination. And I'm going to remain in the Ccc AP. Can we look at that document, please? That's CD 9.48.
Hang on.
Are we there?
Just opening up. Thank you very much.
Okay. No, not at all. And can we go in that document, please, to page 37?
Yes.
You addressed in your evidence in chief yesterday the various measures that the CCCAP includes, short, medium, and long-term measures. And in fact, you highlighted as one of the long-term measures the first bullet point that we see on that page, delivering infrastructure required for airlines to operate low-carbon aircraft. Now, before you say anything, I know that your assessment does not rely on the uptake of low-carbon aircraft. But it's right, isn't it, that the CCCAP does, in its long-term measures, rely on looking at delivering infrastructure required for airlines to operate low-carbon aircraft?
Yes, it does.
Can we look, please, at Mr. Asher's supplementary proof of evidence?
Are you coming back to the CCAP?
I'm going to look at this bullet point in relation to Mr. Asher's proof of evidence. His supplementary proof, please.
Sure. Sorry, I was only asking which windows to close. Sorry. Okay, Mr. Asher's.
Paragraph 8.4 to 8.8.
Oh, hang on.
Sorry.
His proof of evidence, yes?
So his supplementary proof of evidence.
Thank you. And paragraph?
8.4 to 8.8.
Okay, yes.
He sets out here, and refers back to his main proof, with regards to hydrogen electric or battery electric aircraft, what it is currently known that airports would need in terms of their infrastructure in order for the take-up of those technologies to be possible. He then, over the page, also addresses the current proposal, and then at 8.6 to 8.8, well, 8.7, he addresses why the current proposal does not support the infrastructure required to allow low-carbon aircraft to use the airport.
I disagree. I thought this was raised yesterday, or perhaps the day before, that there general development orders that allow the airport to reconfigure some of its internal infrastructure. And if the airport needs to change the infrastructure required to support low carbon aircraft, then it will do. So I thought that was addressed previously.
So what Mr. Ash is pointing out here is not just the need for internal rearrangements of the aircraft, of the airport, but he's pointing out, precisely as you pick up in the CCCAP, the need for more significant infrastructure changes for the airport to be able to support low carbon flying. Maybe I can just put the general point to you to see if we can get through this. It's right, isn't it, that you're putting forward as a mitigation for expansion of the airport that the airport will review and undertake feasibility studies on providing infrastructure, which this expansion of the airport will not, in fact, assist in delivering.
And this assessment is not reliant on that particular mitigation measure being applied. So I think what's demonstrated here is that we are looking beyond the mitigation required. We're looking at the long-term mitigation required to help deliver the longer-term carbon net zero, the decarbonisation of the aviation sector. And it would be wrong, I think, not to signal that indeed every airport in the UK will be looking at, maybe around the world, will be looking at how they need to rearrange their infrastructure over time to accommodate new types of airplane. So I don't agree with your point.
Okay. And of course, as you say, well, no, I won't pick it up. So then section 7, please, in Mr. Asher's main proof of evidence.
Okay, hang on. Yes, alternative jet fuels.
Alternative jet fuels and sustainable aviation fuels. He sets out in this section biofuels and synthetic fuels and the sustainability challenges that arise in sourcing these fuels at scale. You do not take issue with any of that, do you?
I'm not sufficiently aware of the intricacies of the subject to be able to contest what Mr. Asher says.
So in the CCCAP, and this is the last time we'll go directly to it, one of the things that's put forward in the bullet points, that's the third bullet point, is working with airlines and innovation partners to drive understanding developments at scale and uptake of low-carbon flight initiatives such as SAF. That's sustainable aviation fuel, isn't it?
Yes, it is, yes.
But as you've just indicated, you're not sufficiently aware of the intricacies as Mr. Asher is, and so you haven't, in formulating the CCCAP, taken into account any of the sustainability challenges that arise in sourcing these fuels at scale, have you?
What we've referred to is the evidence that's available around sustainable aviation fuel, and the government, including, for example, the report by Ricardo, and the government's position that it wants to promote and develop SAF as one means of decarbonising the aviation sector.
So is the answer to the question, no, you haven't?
No, I haven't looked at it in detail, no.
And then finally, in the CCCAP, and this is the last time we're going to look at the document, can we look at paragraph 4.4.13, please? Nope, that's not right. Can we look at, that's your main proof of evidence. Yes, let's look at your main proof of evidence, please, 4.4.13.
4.4.13. Emissions from buildings and ground operators.
Correct. So we've got there your indication of the extent of non-aviation emissions. Which we see as 6.78 thousand tonnes of CO2 emissions. And the CCCAP, as you have told us repeatedly, addresses reduction of the ground emissions and the building emissions, doesn't it?
The CCCAP covers Scope 1, Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions.
Yes. But as far as Scope 3 emissions are covered, that's in the long-term measures which we've just been looking at.
No, absolutely not. So, for example, the all-electric turnaround trial that was, I think there was a note submitted to the appeal yesterday, is an example of where BAL is influencing its Scope 3 emissions.
So it's the all-electric turnaround and the long-term measures we've just been looking at?
No, there are other short-term measures, medium-term measures and long-term measures that look at Scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions.
I was looking at just Scope 3 emissions. That was pretty clear in the way I put my question to you.
Okay. So the Scope 3 emissions, there are measures included, both short, medium and long-term.
Maybe we can short-circuit it like this. In terms of the emissions that the expansion to 2 million passengers per annum is anticipated to achieve by 2030, that is, as I recall, around 80,000 tonnes of CO2 per year. Is that your recollection? I can take you to a document.
I need to check it, but let's assume that. Yeah, I'll go with that. Yep.
Okay. And so, in terms of the aviation emissions versus the ground emissions, it's clear that the aviation emissions are very many times larger than the ground and building emissions, aren't they?
Yes. Yes, the aviation emissions are by far the largest source of emissions associated with the airport, yes.
Yes. And in terms of what the CCCAP looks at, certainly more than half of the CCCAP focuses on buildings and ground operations rather than on aviation emissions, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. But I would point out that the CCCAP has a regular review process, and indeed it will be developed further. I think it's the next 6 months to reflect that. So I'm sure other measures to address aviation emissions will be included as time goes on.
Yes, but of course your assuredness about that is not something that assists the inspectors right now. They're going to have to take into account the CCCAP as it is before them.
That's correct, but the CCCAP provides a mechanism for reporting the emissions from each different source, different scope, if you like. It includes a mechanism for identifying short, medium-term measures, long-term measures, and it identifies a mechanism for review of that process. So to have an action plan that is fixed today that's relevant in 2050 would be incorrect. So what we've done is take an approach where the action plan is reviewed every 5 years, and that was agreed with Dr. Hinnells.
Last questions. You referred yesterday in your evidence in chief to the new greenhouse gas removal plant in Iceland.
Yes.
That's a pilot plant, as I understand it, isn't it?
No, it's in full production.
Well, we'll put some evidence in on that then. And are you aware of the tonnage of greenhouse gas removals that the plant is going to be achieving?
That particular one is 4,000 tonnes per year, and they are now looking at 110 times that size.
Yes. But if we're looking at that particular plant, which you used as one of your examples, if one wished to remove the additional greenhouse gas emissions from the expansion just in 2030, one would need 20 new removal plants, wouldn't one? To remove
If
80,000.
you were on that measure alone, yes, that's correct.
So thank you, those are my questions.
Okay, okay, thank you very much. Mr. Morehouse, is there anything left for you?
Just one subject area we
Surely.
hopefully not displeased to hear. Good afternoon, Mr. Ozund-Ireland. Can you hear me clearly?
I can, thank you.
Good.
Yes.
I think
Good afternoon.
you might be able to see me in a moment as well. Good. I just want to pick up on one issue, which is following on from, I think, your acceptance that a robust assessment is would use the CCC assessments, any robust assessment of climate risks.
Yes, a robust assessment obviously should take account of the CCC, of course.
Yes.
Whether the assessment should be based on comparing directly with one of the pathways proposed by the Climate Change Committee, I would question that. I'm not sure that's a completely robust approach.
Okay, well, I'd like to take you to the balanced net zero pathway, which is in the document submitted at INQ 63, the document submitted yesterday.
Yes.
And if everyone has that, if you can turn to page 10 of the PDF, 262 of the document itself.
Widespread innovation is the first bullet point.
Widespread innovation at the top, yes, and
Yes.
if you go down to the bottom, or towards the bottom, the paragraph
Yep.
starting, our scenario for the balanced net zero pathway takes elements from each of the above pathways. And I just want
Yes.
to look at and unpack a little bit the demand growth point underneath that. It reads, our demand growth by 2050 matches the headwinds at 25%, although the passenger growth profile is more gradual due to an assumption of no net capacity expansion at UK airports in this scenario. This arises as a function of the 2050 passenger numbers, 365 million passengers, being within the current UK airport capacities, at least 370 million passengers, and the need to ensure that the UK achieves net zero by 2050, with aviation still one of the largest emitting sectors. We therefore do not assume a surge in emissions occurs in the early 2030s, as happens with the airport expansion, modelled in the headwinds and widespread innovation scenarios. Airport expansion could still occur under the balanced pathway, but would require capacity restrictions elsewhere in the UK. That is effectively a reallocation of airport capacity. Now, I just want to unpack that a little bit. What the balanced net zero pathway envisages is between the 2018 figures and 2050, that there'll be a 25% growth in passengers, doesn't it?
It does, yes.
And that effectively is reflecting government policy, which is to continue to permit growth in the numbers of passengers.
I think it's more than just passengers. They also want to encourage trade, don't they? So there's implicit within that is freight. But yes. Yeah.
Now, what we see there is it's envisaged that 25% growth by 2050 will take the passenger numbers up to 365 million per annum.
Okay. Yes.
And what it says there is that the current UK airport capacity is already at 370 million. So in order to accommodate that 25% growth by 2050, the UK has, do you agree, already achieved its requirements for airport capacity?
I would agree as a whole, as the UK as a whole. Of course, I would not know how that relates to individual areas or regions' economic growth profiles and leveling up and so on. it might be all of that capacity is sitting in an airport which is not being is not being used. I don't know. I don't know I haven't looked at the detail of how those, if you like, headroom of capacity, maybe, I don't know what you might say, but the difference between the passenger numbers and the capacity of each airport, I haven't looked at that.
No, and of course, the same issue is, of course, addressed in the CCC assessment, because it says that expansion could still occur under the balanced pathway, but would require capacity restrictions elsewhere in the UK. So if you're going to grant capacity in one place, you need to take it away somewhere else, don't you? If you're going to hit the target.
In terms of capacity, I absolutely agree with that. And I think it's a good example here where the Climate Change Committee is providing advice to the government. But it is ducking the issue of who's going to tell each region, each airport, and divvy up the capacity. Would that be done on a winter-summer basis? Would it be done year for year?
I'd like you to have a look, while we're looking at airport expansion, then at another document then, please, which is at CD 9-130, which is the CCC's report to Parliament as of June 2021.
Yes. Okay, yeah, that's up, thank you.
If you can turn to page 186 of that document, please.
Yeah.
So I think we've agreed with a 25% expansion in passengers, we've already at capacity, we already have the capacity in the UK. These figures here are showing, in the table B4.4, show the airport capacity expansion plans in the UK. So we can see there the London airport's just over, I think, well, around about 110 million, and we've got outside of London the expansions of Bristol, Doncaster, Sheffield, and Leeds, Bradford.
Yes, I can see that, yes.
If all of those proceed on our successful applications, or even if some of them proceed in our successful applications, do you concede that that would make a considerable impact on the government's ability to achieve the net zero objective, given the capacity available to date?
I think within the balanced pathway scenario that the CCC puts together, yes, it would. And I think what should also be included in this figure would be the airports listed that would be negative. So presumably there'd be a balance between the two, right? So I noticed that there was no recommendations of which airport should have their capacity or growth limited to balance those expansion plans.
Yes.
But I would say just one final thing is that please note that the balanced pathway approach is not the only pathway available.
Yes. Now you've made reference to limiting airports to balance that out across the country. Do you concede that it may not be your area of expertise, but if for example, a given airport has got a capacity of X million passengers per year and the government decides to cut that, there's going to be huge financial implications, aren't there, for the taxpayer to compensate that airport for those reductions, aren't there? There'll have to be some recompense, so it doesn't come without cost.
And there's political cost as well.
And political cost as well.
Yes, completely agree with you.
Thank you. So just to be clear, those are all my questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Humphreys, any idea of how long your re-examination may be? Yeah, sure.
So I've got, I think, 23 points. That's not 23 questions, but 23 points, because I tend to number them. You know, if each one was, you know, just over 2 minutes, I'm talking about an hour. Well, I tend to sort of calculate with ways like that and break things down and then put numbers on them. So I will, it's difficult for me to judge this completely because obviously it's all kind of live and
Yeah, sure.
you know, haven't had very long to think about it, but I would think about an hour, which is, I assume, longer than you would wish, and I apologise.
No, I'm not at all trying to cut trying to cut you down. I'll be absolutely honest with you. I'm getting very tired. We probably all are.
Yes, me too.
Well, I think we need to move on because I really don't want to defer this until next week.
I agree, sir.
Because there could well be people who aren't available next week.
Yes, sir.
So, yeah, if you can carry on, Mr. Humphreys, but I'd appreciate brevity.
So if there are ways in which I can shorten things, I surely will try and do that.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Osland, again, forgive me too for not appearing to look at you. I am. It's just I'm looking at your image in the screen. There were a number of questions early on from Mr. Taylor about assessments that the government had or had not undertaken of aviation's ability to grow within either the sixth carbon budget or the net zero target, and a number of different questions, obviously they'll all be recorded, were asked. And you then said at one point, but you have to rely on government policy and regulation and the duty to achieve the budgets. And then these questions went on about this hasn't been assessed and that hasn't been assessed and so on. When the inspectors are trying to grapple with these questions of what government has or has not done, what is the overall legal and indeed policy context within which government is operating?
I think the starting point for that would be the Climate Change Act and the duties upon the Secretary of State. There is also the UK ETS, and there is Corsair, and how that is integrated or interfaces with the UK ETS. And remember, the ETS is based on a cap. So aviation emissions within the ETS cannot exceed that cap. So that is a very clear way of controlling those emissions. And then beyond that, there are the various policies which can be used to encourage or to support the decarbonisation of the aviation industry to ensure it remains within the cap and remains within the budgets.
Now, I'm going to come back to one or two of those themes, but you were also early on taken to the Aviation 2050 document, and I'm going to take you there, and then I'm going to take you to another document, and then I'm going to just ask you a few more questions. So firstly, CD 6.5. And within that document, I think you need page 60, because that's the page that you went to before.
Of the PDF?
Of the PDF. Sorry, it's not page 60, it's page 76. I do apologise, that's a reference to another document. Page 76.
Okay.
And much of the cross-examination, we'll come to this later, was talking about aviation generally. But I want to bring us back to the test agreed with Dr. Hinnells for an application. And you see there, paragraph 3.96, government proposes to require planning applications for capacity growth to provide full assessment of emissions. Firstly, have we provided a full assessment of emissions?
Yes.
And then next, drawing on all feasible cost-effective measures to limit their climate impact. You've just had a discussion on the CCCAP, but has the CCCAP identified all the feasible cost-effective measures to limit climate impacts of the development?
I would say, in as much as we can today, yes, but I have absolutely no doubt more measures will arise as we move forward in time.
And then demonstrating that their project, so I want to take you to this, so this is about not aviation generally, but the project will not have a material impact, so it's not just an impact, a material impact on, let's understand what we've got to not have a material impact on, the government's ability to meet its carbon reduction targets. Now, you just told me a few moments ago about the legislative and policy context. What should the inspectors, in the light of your calculation of the emissions, the quantity of the emissions, which is not disputed, what should they conclude about the project before them and whether it will have a material impact on the government's ability to meet its carbon reduction targets?
The contribution from the project to the emissions as a whole, aviation emissions as a whole, or indeed all of the emissions within the carbon budgets, is very, very small. So from that, we can conclude that the application should not prevent the government being able to achieve its policies. In fact, I would go further. BAL is through the work it's done already, and through its ongoing carbon action plan, it's actually going beyond what the government is expecting of the aviation sector.
Can we look at how the test is expressed in the airport's national policy statement? So for that, you need CD 9.28.
Okay.
And within that document, that's the one where you need to go to page 60.
Mitigation is the heading.
That's the overall heading, but move to the bottom of the page and you'll see decision making.
Apologies. Okay.
So 5.82. And we know, of course, following the review letter, that this document is not being reviewed. Any increase in carbon emissions alone is not a reason to refuse development consent unless the increase in carbon emissions resulting from the project is so significant that it would have a material impact on the ability of the government to meet its carbon reduction targets, including the carbon budgets. Now, again, in relation to the test as worded there, the increase should not be a reason for refusal unless the increase is so significant that it has that material effect. Again, is the increase from this project so significant that it has a material effect, material impact on the government's ability to meet its targets?
I would say no.
Now, much of the rest of the cross-examination then dwelt on things about aviation generally. So we're going to come to some of those. And you were taken at one point to MBU and Dr. Hinnell's table on his paragraph 59, so we need to probably just touch on that.
Dr. Hinnell's evidence or MBU?
Dr. Hinnell's evidence. So the questions were about MBU, and then you were taken to
Right.
Dr.
Okay.
Hinnell's paragraph 59, and the table there, and the number 11.8 million. But does the MBU policy document say that the capacity it is talking about, making best use, is in some way capped to 11.8 million?
I've not seen that in the document, no.
And you were then taken through an exercise where various other expansion proposals were proposed, and I think in the numbers we got to 13 million, and then it was 26 million, and then when Heathrow was added, more again. When government made its recent statement in that footnote 39, that MBU remains the most up-to-date policy and should be given full effect, should we assume that government was aware of these applications and indeed in many cases permissions?
Yes.
And you were taken at one point to the letter that was sent by the department to North Somerset Council. Could we have that?
INQ.
It's INQ 42.
Yes.
And you were taken to on pages 22 and 23 of that document, PDF pages, to sections 24.1, 24.2, and then 24.3. And in 24.3, which is on page 23, it responds to a query. It says government has set out its support for airports making best use of their existing runways in its policy statement, MBU. MBU remains the government's current policy, and continues to have full effect in planning decisions. As stated in the footnote, MBU continues to have full effect in relation to planning decisions. When making that statement literally just a few days ago, again, can we assume that the department was aware of what's happening in the airport world generally in relation to applications and permissions and proposals when saying that this remains current government policy?
Sorry, there was a noise in the background. Yeah, yes, yes. When writing that letter, the government is.
And again, in relation to those various numbers that were put to you about expansion and airports, you said at one point that you were asked about the numbers of passengers, and you said at one point, well, the purpose is to cap the carbon emissions. So if the objective is to achieve net zero or to achieve certain carbon budgets, does simply looking at passenger numbers really assist with whether the carbon budget is going to be met?
No, it doesn't. And let me give an example, actually. So if we looked at just passenger numbers, then, for example, there's been some recent news about two airlines purchasing and not purchasing modern aircraft. So if we were looking at just passenger numbers, neither of those airlines would be driven, if you like, by carbon in the purchase of those aircraft. However, if we focus on limiting carbon emissions, then the purchasing decision made by those airlines would take account of carbon.
There were then a whole series of questions directed in a sense to policy and the status of policy, and in relation to MBU, I think the inspectors have probably heard all they want to, probably slightly more than they would really want to, in relation to that. So I'm not going to retrace that ground. I will just touch, though, because it's a slightly different point, on the DFT letter, if we could look at that. So that's INQ 063. No, it's not.
62?
62.
62, right. DFT letter dated 6th of September.
That's absolutely the correct one. And you were asked a lot of questions about that and what had significantly changed, and the conclusion that it's not possible to conclude that any of the policy would have been materially different. And as we know, there is that they have declined to review the ANPS in relation to those requests. Can we go to the end of the document just to see where that is dealt with? So the last page, no other matters. The Secretary of State has concluded that no other matters have been identified, whether raised by persons requesting a review or otherwise, which would cause him to think it appropriate to review the ANPS at present. Overall, none of the matters raised make it appropriate to review the ANPS now, when assessed either individually or cumulatively. As mentioned above, this conclusion is also made taking into account Section 10.2 obligation of contributing to the achievement of sustainable development, and in particular the desirability of mitigating and adapting to climate change. So they've specifically taken that into account. And then next, the government and the Secretary of State recognise the importance of having up-to-date national policy statements to maintain the integrity of the nationally significant infrastructure project regime. So seeing that the government recognised the importance of having up-to-date national policy statements, recognising that they have decided not to review the national policy statement in relation to exactly the same points that are being raised in relation to NBU and in the context of all the other government comments on NBU, what properly should the inspectors, what judgment should they form about what the government's view of NBU and its status?
I really would like to answer this question, but I really feel that I'm not the right person to answer the question to. And if you forgive me, I'm quite tired now, so I'm going to have nightmares about this letter. But yeah. So if you don't mind, I'll pass.
Of course, I quite understand. We then moved to a whole series of questions which were based around the theme of whether you or the airport's case relies on the ETS alone. And you said, no, of course you have looked at other measures, and I just want to explore that with you. But in the course of those answers, you referred to the CCC methodology, and I think this one is INQ 063. So perhaps finally I can get you to go to that document.
Okay, I already have that up actually.
And I think we looked at page 10. We looked at that, which is that the balanced net zero pathway was based on an assumption of no net capacity at UK airports, and you noted it was an assumption. Can we also look at page 17 in the document? Which is talking about the impact of demand policies, and it talks about the various of the things that could happen: efficiencies, SAF costs, do not have the ability to feed the specific decarbonisation costs back, modelling, but towards the end, the particular policies that might be utilised to manage demand could have different impacts on ticket price, e.g. carbon pricing, frequent flyer levy, VAT, fuel, ADP reform, airport capacity management. The CCC analysis is focused on the outcomes, demand, fuel, emissions, rather than prescribing or modelling the policy method for achieving the demand levels required. So in the context where the capacity constraint was in fact just an assumption, and that the CCC analysis has focused on the outcomes rather than prescribing or modelling the policy method to achieve them, what does that tell us about these various, this mix of things that even the CCC thought might go into balanced pathway?
It's, I think, two things I would say. One is that there are different mechanisms available. And secondly, it's all about the outcome. And the outcome, I would say the outcome is emissions. It's about the carbon emissions, not necessarily the demand management. Because I think that if you focus on demand management, that isn't necessarily going to get us to carbon net zero. We need to be looking at different mechanisms which are listed here. And I note that this list of measures and the statement that the CCC analysis is focused on outcomes is actually repeated in this document. So it is an important point.
And looking at those other measures, so, you know, other than obviously the ETS and CORSIA, but these various other levers that are available to government, I just want to understand the extent to which they have been taken into account in the forecasting topic we had at the start of the inquiry. Could we just look at your addendum?
Yeah. And
And I want to go to your appendix.
the annex to the addendum. Yes. Okay. Yes. The appendix. Yes. Yeah.
And this was commenting on whether decarbonising transport or the Jet Zero consultation caused Mr. Brass to change anything in the forecast, and he explains in this document under various headings why it doesn't. But on page 5 of that annex, paragraph 3.1.2, he says, as has already been discussed in some detail in the air traffic forecasting report and in my proof of evidence, the appeal proposal traffic forecast already include carbon pricing in the assessment of future growth rates, both for the central carbon costs and the higher carbon costs. The forecasts also allow for higher ADP in the future, although the Jet Zero consultation would appear to rule this out. And then he tells us there's no reason to adjust. And in the next section, he also looks at carbon prices that have been modelled. But just staying with that paragraph, insofar as the CCC appeared in order to deal with demand policies, that's the heading, things like carbon pricing and ADP and so on, was that explicitly taken into account, so far as you're aware, in the earlier topics on forecasting?
Yes. So I would be grateful if we don't revisit it.
All right, I'll promise not to then. The next point, you were then taken through the various measures, the UK ETS and CORSIA. Just on the UK ETS, it was said to you, well, the inspector shouldn't really rely on that because it only goes, or at least it only shows caps to 2030, and therefore we just don't know what happens beyond that. But first point, does the UK ETS just relate to aviation, or is it the entire traded sector?
Well, by definition, it is the traded sector, so it covers a whole range of combustion plants, hospitals, small emitters, as well as aviation.
Just because the government has not currently set caps beyond 2030, is there any reason to suspect that from 2030 onwards no caps will be set, bearing in mind the Secretary of State's duties under the Climate Change Act?
Absolutely not. And I think I mentioned at the time that I would need to reread the order to see if there is a, if you like, close date for the order, an expiry date, but there is no reason why the order cannot be extended, and certainly the EU ETS, it's been made very clear that the EU wants to continue it, and I would not see the UK government having a different view at this stage, at this time.
Thank you. And you were asked about CORSIA.
Yes.
And that only goes to 2035. I mean, you expressed in your oral evidence, and indeed, in your written evidence, that obviously government is aware of some of the criticisms of CORSIA and is grappling with how the two systems will align. But again, is there any reason to believe, in the context of the legal duties on government, that CORSIA or replacement of CORSIA by some other system will not continue beyond 2035?
Well, CORSIA is being developed by ICAO, and ICAO is an agency or part of the United Nations, which is also promoting the international measures and policies to combat climate change. So it would be strange for ICAO to think differently. So I think it's perfectly reasonable to assume CORSIA or something similar to CORSIA would need to remain in place.
Thank you. And then there was a whole series of questions about capacity and capacity caps, and you were asked whether the possibility of a capacity cap, not talking about demand management now, but a capacity cap in the future had been ruled out, and you said, well, it hasn't been ruled out, but does the concept of a capacity cap currently appear in government policy? Has government capped capacity?
No, it doesn't, and government policy is clear. It sees growth in the aviation sector.
And again, it seemed to be suggested that in some way government ought to undertake some national, supranational sort of planning exercise where it decided where capacity should be provided. Is there any indication in any policy document that the government intends to move away from normal market mechanisms and towards a central planned approach to where capacity should be provided?
No.
Sorry, so I'm just trying to see if there are things I can not ask. Then if I move on to questions this afternoon from Mr. Hearn. Again, you were asked, of course, a number of questions in the context of Professor Anderson's evidence and then Mr. Asher's evidence, and in the context of Professor Anderson's evidence, you were asked questions about local carbon targets and Ima and targets consistent with the Paris agreement. Clearly, you've set out in your evidence the framework of the UK's obligations under the Paris Agreement to set out its nationally determined contributions, and then we know obviously there are carbon budgets within those, but is there beyond that any either legal or policy requirement to test the significance of development projects against Professor Anderson's local carbon budgets? Is there law or policy that says that we're supposed to do that?
No, there isn't. But I will say I did actually find that much interesting. But no, there is no direct policy requirement to use that method.
And then a little bit later, you were asked various questions about Ima Guidance, legal duty to meet net zero, and engagement with other controls. If one looks at aviation, which is in the traded sector now, and, for example, road transport, which is not in the traded sector, insofar as government needs to take measures to ensure that carbon budgets are met, over which types of development, either traded or non-traded, does government have the most direct levers in which to achieve future budgets?
Well, yes. It depends a bit on the. It depends on the activity we're talking about. But I think in the context of this conversation, it's clearly the traded sector. But for industry, for example, there is obviously the role of the Environment Agency. So that's would be different.
And then we came on another slightly different point. We came on to discuss the CCC's pathways, and you've made the point on a number of occasions that the CCC actually has a number of different pathways, and perhaps we could just look at those. Those are in your proof at page 42. And we can see them in table 4.1, and these are all CCC pathways. Do they all meet the CCC's ambition of ultimately meeting net zero?
Yes, of course, yes.
And so although there has been a huge amount of focus on the balance pathway and how that has been examined, presumably the CCC has taken equal care with its other pathways. If we look at widespread innovation as one of the CCC's pathways, what does that one assume in terms of levels of demand compared with 2018, and indeed capacity constraint?
Well, I think the approach that Professor Anderson used, again, I'm really interested in that, but I would like to expand that to include all of the pathways that the CCC, if you like, offers, and indeed that perhaps compare that to other pathways that are provided by Sustainable Aviation and others, to see how that would. Where does this development fit within that range of pathways, if you like? So I actually thought Professor Anderson's approach was really interesting again.
And we know also that that the Department for Transport, in its consultation document on Jet Zero, has set out for other, they don't call them pathways, they call them scenarios, and are those also in the mix as potential ways in which the government sees aviation reaching or being consistent with net zero?
Yes, I mean, if we pick up on the CCC's statement that, in theory, there could be any number of pathways or scenarios developed. So there's no reason to not compare the DFT scenarios alongside the CCC ones, or indeed the Sustainable Aviation one.
And if we just come back to Professor Anderson, you were asked about whether the emissions you forecast are inconsistent with the CCC's balanced pathway, that particular one, and you said actually by reference to table 4.1, your assumptions on which you modelled were actually more conservative than the CCC, but the point was being put to you that, well, in some way we are inconsistent. If we just go to Professor Anderson's evidence again, perhaps turn to page 21.
Okay.
Which was Professor Anderson's figure 1.
My you have to wait a bit. So. Professor Anderson's proof of evidence, yes?
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. And the page?
21.
Thank you.
That's hard copy 21.
It's the same PDF.
I think it will be the same. His figure 1.
Yes.
And you may remember, if you saw the cross-examination, the point that I put to him. He's obviously rebased these both these lines to 100, but if you leave the CCC's balanced pathway at 100, but actually then work out, well, what percentage of that, using your data, are emissions would be, and they're a fraction of 1%. I think the vertical index is in 20s, so I think 0.3% is going to be almost the thickness of the line at the bottom. To what extent can it be properly concluded that the airport's emissions with expansion are inconsistent with the balanced pathway?
Okay, well, first of all, the vertical axis is an index, so it's not percentage, so we can simply compare the percentages.
I know it's not a percentage, but because the CCC's balanced pathway happens to have been rebased to 100, if that's 100 and you're 0.3%,
I see. Okay. Yes. Okay. Then it would show that Bristol Airport without development would also not be in line with the balanced net and net zero pathway. But I think to put this graph into context, I think all of the Climate Change Committee pathways should be on the graph. It's because all of them achieve net zero.
Yes, and does Bristol Airport with expansion compromise the government's ability, should it wish to do so, to achieve the balanced pathway, bearing in mind the scale of that particular expansion?
Well, that's right. So that's what this graph could potentially show, and it's a bit dangerous because I haven't done the analysis here. But if we had the red lines, if we had all the red lines that show the different pathways, and maybe indeed the DFT scenarios and the sustainable aviation scenarios were all plotted in the same way, then would we see the Bristol Airport without and with the expansion? Would we see that difference? We would then see it in the context of those pathways, and that would, yes, that could, in terms of this way of making the impact assessment, that would be a useful analysis.
Thank you. Then I think we're still on Mr. Hone, who asked you a series of questions about the facilities that will be needed for no and low carbon aircraft with expansion in the future.
Yes.
But will exactly those same issues be faced whether or not the airport expands? Yes.
Yes, because the emphasis is on the airlines to reduce their emissions, and so in the same way that any airport will be looking to facilitate the airlines operating, if the airlines wish to use or need certain facilities to use low carbon fuels, then the airport will want to provide that. So that's with or without the development, yes.
And then, final point, from Mr. Morehouse, and again, he was back on the CCC's report, and again chose to focus on the balanced pathway, which ends up with 365 million passengers per annum. That's an increase of 73 million passengers. Again, as we agreed before, there's no statement in government policy that intends to cap capacity or decide where capacity should be provided. But what is the market mechanism that allows demand as it arises around the country to be met?
Sorry, do you mind repeating the question? I'm really sorry.
It's all right. If you don't sort of adopt a North Korean model and decide where capacity is going to be and which company can expand and which doesn't, in an open market economy, how are those things decided? How do we decide which business can expand and which doesn't?
Well, it's based on price. It's based on the market. So the demand, if you like, is or the demand is I suppose defined. I'm going to get this wrong because I'm not an economist, but it's defined by the price. So it would be the market mechanisms that the UK operates.
Thank you.
With.
So I've done a little bit better. I know not too much, but thank you.
Right. Thank you both. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Dr. Hudson.
Yeah, particularly Dr.
Ireland.
Excuse me, Dr. Hudson Ireland. I appreciate that doing these things virtually is even more tiring than for the rest of us in the room, so thank you for that. Okay, we'll obviously now adjourn until Tuesday at 9:30. Have a good weekend, everyone.